Hello and welcome. You're listening to the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to knowledge and research on the evolution and new frontiers of multilateralism. And our guest today is joining us online from Georgetown University in Qatar. She is Lynda Iroulo, Assistant Professor of International Relations. And her interests lie in decolonial international relations, the design of international and regional organizations, African regional integration, and Africa in global politics. Lynda is also an associate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, the GIGA in Hamburg, and she is also an associate research fellow, UNU Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. So, Lynda, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful. And just by way of an introduction, I wanted to ask what drew you first to this question of how African states in all their diversity shape multilateral institutions rather than simply operate within them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. It's an honor to have, to be a part of this podcast. I always like to start this conversation by saying, first, I'm African, and my academic journey, started in Nigeria as a bachelor's student as well as a master's student. And I always, even including my students when I teach them international politics, I tell them, I started as a historian. For me, my journey in academia started with the interest and, the history of Africa, specifically the region that I was part of, which was West Africa. And at the master's level, I sort of moved on to questions about what was diplomacy like during pre-colonial Africa. But the more I dive deeper into history, the more I realize how much our colonial, experiences have shaped politics in today's Africa. I know I'm using Africa, which is, it's a huge continent with so many member states, and I'm going to keep flagging this as we speak. And, I kept asking my lecturers at the time, what is the African Union? And it's unfortunate because in as much as we spoke about it while being a bachelor student in Nigeria, it was never, a course on its own. I don't know, because I started as a historian, but I don't know if those who studied international politics, political science had the same experience. So we didn't have a course on regionalism. So I would, read and see these pockets of African Union, Organization of African Unity, and I got more interested. I was like, what is this institution exactly? What is it created to do, and how far has it done what it was created to do? And the more I read about that, the more I was fascinated about regionalism. And I wrote, by the time I applied for a PhD, I wrote my proposal based on this, specifically looking at the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is a unique monitoring organization of the African Union in order to assess states based on good governance targets and advise them. Initially, the proposal was set up to understand to what extent that institution had solved or addressed the issues that it was created to address. But the more I studied it, and of course, the more I got my feedback from, different reviewers, it kept moving me towards, let's go back in history again and look at the creation of the African Peer Review Mechanism. Why was it created? Who are the actors who created it? What is the politics of the creation of the African Peer Review Mechanism? And that is how I got to where I am at with, studying regionalism and sort of continuing to flesh out those politics.
Well, we're going to hear much more about that, particularly about the peer mechanism later on.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you again another sort of introductory question on the misconception that people have about the role of various African states in the UN. What would those misconceptions be?
Yeah, for me, the one, misconception that comes to mind is the idea that African actors, passive agents in multilateralism. And I would also flag that there's been, for those who read a lot of critical scholarship, you may argue, okay, there's been research ongoing to kind of breach this gap. And there is, but there is still room for improvement. And, that misconception is still there, that African actors are passive agents in multilateralism. The idea that they are rule takers and not rule makers. Yeah, we understand where that, perception is coming from, but that is the misconception. And that is what I mostly do in my research that a lot of, critical scholars have started to study.
So we really need to shift that.
Yeah.
So thinking about that too, how do different African states perceive the UN? And, how do they also feel considered in the system?
Yeah. So for me, it would be difficult to really kind of break down how specific member states perceive the United Nations. Of course, the African Union is an organization, the largest regional organization with 55 member states. The 55th member being the Western Sahara member state, which is not recognized in the United Nations, and that's a whole other conversation. So it's a lot of member states to like individually think about. But having studied this organization, looking at the speeches at the creation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, there's one common theme, if I'm to think about one when it comes to a more macro level analysis, is that they welcomed the creation of the United Nations. They welcomed the fact that there was this global organization that dealt with global issues, and we can see that in the fact that a lot of the leaders of the time, went to the United Nations and gave speeches and were eventually accepted as member states. Kwame Nkrumah, many of these leaders, Gaddafi as well, all gave speeches at the United Nations at some point. And they welcomed it. But at the same time, I think there was a realization that there needed to be a regional organization to complement the United Nations work. And this is evident. The African Union has a beautiful compilation of speeches in 1963 at the creation of the organization of leaders across the continent. And it was Sekou Touré who actually said this, that we need to realize, and he's saying this in 1963, that the United Nations that was created is still flawed because it's created for a specific time and it needs to be reformed to adapt to present situation. And this is the same argument, unfortunately, that a lot of us are still making today, that the United Nations was created at a specific time. So, and Haile Selassie follows that speech and says, we need to create an organization and have an organization that complements the United Nations. So we don't disregard the activities of the United Nations, but we create an organization that complements it and, makes both the activities of the OAU and the United Nations both credible and effective. And that is how they still perceive the United Nations today, if I argue at that micro level, that the United Nations still remains a very important international organization and the African Union needs to work alongside it. But it's, the flaws of that organization, the flaws of the United Nations even intensifies the need to have the African Union to complement its activities.
The importance of regionalism.
Mm-hmm.
You started out by saying your studies started in history and you're a historian. How do you think that African states have really influenced the norms and procedures or coalitions in the UN? Perhaps by giving an example of the way that they've been overlooked.
Yeah. So, and you're right, a lot of the contributions of African actors and the African Union specifically has been, overlooked. And there's been, a lot of contributions there to kind of identify. The first thing that comes to mind is the right to intervene, the responsibility to protect, and this has not been acknowledged. There a good number of critical scholars that have come to trace that norm and how it was driven by discussions happening in the African Union, with the Rwandan genocide, what was going on in Burundi and Somali, and that was why we transformed the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. That's, the OAU that started with, okay, we have gained our independence, we need to secure our sovereignty, and for that reason, we do not want to intervene in the internal affairs of member states. But having seen the results and the consequences of the genocide and what was happening in Somalia, and, in Burundi and many other member states, they realized, okay, we can't just sit back and watch, these human rights abuses, genocides happening across our continent. We have to do something about it. And it was the first chairperson of the Secretariat, Salim, who started the conversation of changing that narrative from a norm of non-intervention to a norm of non-indifference, which means that, we can't stand by. We need to intervene in situation of human rights abuses. So there is that, and that led to, the conversations that happened later on, which led to the subscription to the responsibility to protect. There's also like this peace support operations. These are much more discourse changes within the United Nations, where a lot of, the African member states or group of states, as we know them, decided like we need to change the narrative. It's not just about military personnel going into another state and intervening, militarily, but doing more than that, supporting in order to, bring about peace. And that narrative was changed. We see some, global firsts when it comes to women's rights, for instance. So the African Union has provisions when it comes to women's rights, and they increased the representation of women within the union to 50%, which at the time was even more than the European Commission. So these are all of, some, and I'm just scratching the surface of some of the contributions that the African Union or African actors are making to multilateralism and global governance in general. But a lot of that has been overlooked. That there is room, like I say, for more improvement in really making visible the voices of these actors.
Absolutely. Such significant changes. Yeah. Perhaps a broader question, how does a post-colonial lens change the way we understand the evolution of the UN system?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked this question because, shameless plug here, I'm actually finalizing a book that looks at architects of regional organizations. And within that book, hopefully out in a year or two with Oxford University Press, I look at an approach that I term post-colonial institutionalist theory. And I argue that in international relations, it's important for us to study and understand global South contexts, taking account of their colonial experience. And in this, in this approach, looking at these experiences in a post-colonial institutionalist way, there are three very important angles that need to be considered in all these contexts in order to understand these nuance and its politics and power dynamics. First, historical sensitivity. So who colonized? What was the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and how does it continue to manifest today? And then secondly, it's important to look at agent recognition. So how do actors in resource-constrained regions, and by resource constraints, I'm talking about material resource in terms of financing of institutions and normative resource, in cases where you have ideas and you have, proposals made, but those proposals are not legitimated because they are not legitimated by the West. And then third, it's important to also look at power dynamics. So what is the power dynamics during colonial rule, and what is the power dynamics post-colonial rule? And taking account of these angles in this post-colonial institutionalist approach, we can have a much more nuanced understanding of regional organizations, international organizations, actors within them, and multilateralism in general. So I think that, again, a lot of critical scholars are doing this already, but there is a need to even do more of this investigation, thinking about these angles of post-colonial narrative and how it impacts multilateralism and global governance.
Very interesting. We're going to have to get you back when the book comes out to talk a bit more about it.
Happy to.
But now you brought up issues of power. Thinking about the difference between representation and power in the UN, countries may have a seat at the table, but how much real influence do they actually have?
That's a good question. And the interesting thing about the group of African states is that at the General Assembly, we make up more than 20% of the membership, which means a good, you could argue good voting power, right? But, the question is, things are passed, if you have the group of, African states supporting it, but how much how is commitment? Are states actually implementing this, or is this just all talk and no action? So again, this is the discord or the divergences between having an actual voting power and then seeing it being implemented in reality. And a major challenge that we see in terms of influence, despite the African group of states number and voting power within the General Assembly, we don't see that reflected in the United Nations Security Council. And I think a lot of us are sounding like anti-gong now, because we keep talking about the fact that the UNSC was created in 1945 and does not address the current membership of the United Nations today. So a lot of the issues that are brought to the table of the UNSC is mostly, conflicts that are in Africa. But unfortunately, there is no permanent representation of an African member state in the UNSC. So in as much as they make up the bulk of the General Assembly and the United Nations, influence is still slim, but we can argue that in terms of individual, if you trace individual contributions of African representatives within the United Nations, you can see in terms of discourse how they do influence discourses that end up becoming declarations and treaties. And I think, one of my colleagues, Laura Panselheim, does an interesting research where she traces the discourse on the right to development and shows how not just African actors, but a lot of Global South actors were very instrumental in contributing to that right. So these are some of the narratives that are not very visible in the practice of international relations.
But are resurfacing now, fortunately, with all this research.
Yep.
So do the regional bodies shape how African states act in the UN?
They do. So going back to the speeches made in 1963, one of the important points that was emphasized was that African states needed to come to the United Nations floor with a single voice. And this is where, this is what I find fascinating in my research, because these architects that I talk about, and in most cases, bureaucrats that work within the regional organizations, have to work with this diverse group of actors, 55 member states, civil society, in order to come up with in scholarship, we call it now a common African position, and then bring that to the United Nations floor. So there's a ton of research for those who are interested on the common African positions and how bureaucrats come to negotiate that and bring member states to reach a consensus in order to present a single voice at the United Nations or in other international organizations. Is it easy? No. But the interesting thing about the study is seeing how these preference divergencies eventually become a common African position.
And how then do the regional institutions also help multilateralism adapt to new political realities?
So in as much as it's clear that on the side of the African Union that they can see that there are still gaps within international organizations today, and there's a need for reform, we can see how much regional organizations continue to contribute to international organizations or to multilateralism. I would argue that this is to reinforce the belief that these global institutions are still relevant addressing the issues that we have today. And, I talked about, the responsibility to protect and the contribution to that, the changing of the narrative of like peace support operations. They also contributed to conversations around, funding of peace operations and how the African Union can do that in collaboration with the United Nations in order to address its peace and conflict issues in the continent. And most importantly, I think it was in 2017, a lot was said about the Africa ICC feud. And this is when, the African Union was critiquing the International Criminal Court for being biased in the cases that it took and how it was heavily focused on African leaders. It led to a challenge. It led to, document that was produced about the withdrawal of African member states from the International Criminal Court. But if you read that document closely, it wasn't actually a document for withdrawal, although that was a title. It was a document to reform the International Criminal Court so that it is not used as a pawn by members of the United Nations Security Council in order to punish leaders, in the African continent. So, it's interesting that through these engagements, regional organizations, specifically the African Union, continues to push to challenge and force the United Nations to address its flaws and to reform. And this is how they continue to contribute to multilateralism.
Wonderful. One of your chapters in one of the books that you contributed to starts off with a wonderful African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. Yeah. And if you want to go far, go together. And it really struck me. It's a wonderful proverb. We're talking about multilateralism now, and quite often with the institutions, we tend to think of them as quite fixed structures when they're much better understood as negotiated settlements and they're being constantly adjusted and so on. I wanted to come back to the African peer review mechanism that you have studied so extensively. What can that teach us about the design of international and regional organizations?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start with the proverb that I used, and it was the chapter on the essays on global regionalism that we just published. And the reason I use that proverb is because I felt like, whoever is reading that essay or that chapter could easily relate to that, because those who've watched The Lion King, it was used in The Lion King, and however old you are, young or old, like we all, at some point have watched The Lion King, and we can, relate to that. And it's important because you can't do regionalism alone. And I use that because, I was talking about the scholarship itself, the community of regional scholars. But even in the practice of regionalism, what I've come to see in the development of the African peer review mechanism and the design of it is that there were so many preference divergence. Every member state have its own idea of what a monitoring institution should look like and wanted that reflected in the design. And the role of the architect now is to ensure that everybody goes together, and I term this for the architect in my book. The architect is at the center of that conversation, and I termed it the preference dilemma, where the architect needs to deal with several actors with several preferences, but at the same time find a way to sort of bring them to agree to some sort of templates that they end up creating. So, that is important, for regionalism in practice, but also for regionalism in scholarship. And in that essay, I talk about how there is this divide between scholars who are in the West and scholars who are in Africa, and how they are cited, and how, in some cases, they don't even speak to each other. So, for me, what we can learn in that study is that first, there are always several preferences, and international relations have studied preferences for so many years. But I think what I do is to now change the conversation and refocus the conversation on the architect itself, and now see how the architect deals with those preferences and deals with their own preference dilemma and the process of implementing a mandate that was given to them, which was to create an institution. And on the other hand, I also explain that in doing this, in catering to all these preferences, it takes a lot of thinking and strategizing. And it's important to show those nuances in the study and how much goes into the creation of regional organizations or international organizations.
Very interesting. Yeah. How do you see African states really continuing this fight to help multilateralism remain relevant?
So I see it in continued representation in international organizations. I see it in a continued challenge and their role as entrepreneurs within international organizations. And this is still ongoing, and I feel that, regardless of the importance, I would say, on the need to have regional organizations, the African Union and African member states will still see a need to have the United Nations. And we can see this in a lot of the, collaborations and agreements that has been reached between the African Union and the United Nations, especially when it comes to peace and security. So these contributions will continue in representation and voice in challenging these international institutions.
And do you see signals that multilateralism is changing, becoming more plural, less centered on those power hierarchies of before?
So it's difficult to say. So in March, the declaration was adopted to accept slavery as the gravest crime against humanity. And this was adopted by 123 countries, driven by African group of states. So in a decision where United States voted against it, Argentina, Israel voted against it. The United Kingdom abstained. So looking at that, the spread of the vote, it almost seems like we see it shifting. But it goes back to my concern for the design of the United Nations, that yes, we see this reflected in vote counts, but how can it be also reflected in implementation? So yes, there is a sign of some shift, but is it a shift to pluralism? I'm not sure. I can't say, and I'm not too optimistic.
I was going to ask you, what would be the next shift that you would like to see happen?
The next shift I'd like to see happen is, a true reform of a lot of the international institutions that we have. And I know that reform takes a lot, because we're talking about material resource. A lot of the member states that have the power that they have now is as a result of the contributions they make to international organizations. So the reform is important, and I hope I see that change, but it also means that global South actors need to find a way to collaborate with each other economically in order to contribute more to international organization and hold as much power as other member states. But it is, it's easier said than done, I would say.
But if you were advising listeners on how to think differently about the many African states and the UN, what would you want them to take away from your research as a main point?
Yes, I would say that the history of multilateralism has an African chapter that I think is yet to be completely written. And this is not because it doesn't exist, but it's because we haven't looked closely enough. So we need to change that narrative and it's changing, but there's room for improvement. That African actors haven't been passive actors within multilateralism, that they have contributed. And, there is a need to take a post-colonial approach to studying them, a more nuanced approach to studying them in order to make these voices and these contributions that are invisible visible. And I would also kind of want to frame this by saying that I acknowledge and I applaud a lot of scholars who have studied African regionalism, who've been critical and nuanced about the power dynamics, on who a lot of us, we stand on their shoulders and continue to do this work. And I hope that we become a lot more critical about what we read about African regionalism and its contributions. And I actually like to end with this, specifically this question, with this analogy. So if we think about, imagine we live in a neighborhood and we decide that we want to create a map of the neighborhood. And that neighborhood has a lot of, affluent families whose streets are named and are labeled and are numbered. And I'm very, I can relate to this because I also grew up in a little town in Nigeria where I live in a street that isn't numbered. So you have to really describe to people in order for them to locate you. So imagine we outsource, this job to a cartographer to create a map of a neighborhood like this. Affluent families, not so affluent families, some streets named, others not named. The cartographer, of course, will create a map based on the streets that are named. And if they're unnamed, if they're an unnamed street, then it becomes difficult to account for those people who live in those areas. So changing the narrative of how we study African regionalism would be to now change the methodology. Because, the person who is creating the map will be focusing on neighborhoods that are named and numbered. But it's important to change that methodology in order to understand the unmapped neighborhoods as well. Neighborhoods that are not named and are not numbered. And changing that methodology is important to truly understanding the role of African regionalism, the role it plays in multilateralism and in global governance in general.
What a wonderful analogy. And you've just given us the methodology. So, Lynda Iroulo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much.